speaking with Leslie Kern. She's a member of Independent Jewish Voices New Brunswick, a feminist urban scholar, and a professor at Mount Allison University. Thank you for speaking to the NB Media Co-op today, Leslie.
Thank you for having me.
Israel has been accused of perpetuating a genocide in Gaza, but defenders of the state of Israel often state that such criticisms are anti-Semitic. As a Jewish person and a member of Independent Jewish Voices New Brunswick, how do you respond?
Well, I would respond by saying that the state of Israel as a nation state, as a member of the United Nations, should not be above the same kinds of critiques in terms of human rights, in terms of practices during warfare, and in terms of genocide that we hold any other nation state to. As a Jewish person, I do not believe it's anti-Semitic to critique the state of Israel. In fact, I feel it's part of my duty as a Jewish person who has a moral obligation to work towards tikkun olam, the repair of the world, to hold Israel to just as high a standard as we hold any other nation state, and to raise very serious questions about the practices that they are engaging in Gaza, as well as the West Bank historically, and to ask questions of our own governments here in Canada and around the world as to why we continue to unequivocally support these very problematic actions.
There have been ramifications to the war, of course, around the world, including reports of increased anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish incidents. In New Brunswick, for example, we've seen the recent vandalism at the synagogue in Fredericton, while the Palestine Solidarity Committee has reported at least 2 physical attacks against its members. Could you comment about these incidents, the spike in apparent hate-motivated incidents?
Absolutely. Again, as a Jew, I am always wary of and condemn anti-Semitism, attacks on Jewish organizations of faith and prayer, like the synagogue, and on individual Jewish people. That is never acceptable. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there is also a very long history of anti-Muslim and Islamophobic attacks that occur, and that these in many ways have been both implicitly and explicitly supported by our political leaders, who in some cases have conflated pro-Palestinian activists with terrorists, who have showed up at pro-Palestinian protests to argue with and condemn protesters. So we see a very differential treatment here of these 2 kinds of biased hate crimes. And I think, again, as a Jewish person, I strongly condemn both and see both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim Islamophobic sentiment as both part of white supremacist ideologies that we have to stand together to face down, rather than dividing ourselves and having some kind of competition for who has experienced the most hate crimes or bias.
I wonder if you could comment too, as a scholar, a Jewish scholar, about this seeming kind of clamp down on dissent, when it seems like, I mean, that there's a great tradition of Jewish scholarship, Jewish dissent, political dissent, but there's also a history of clampdowns on that kind of critique, free thought. Any comment on that as a scholar?
Sure. Unfortunately, as you alluded to in an earlier question, there has been a conflation of any critique of the state of Israel, of any pro-Palestinian sentiment, with anti-Semitism. These things are not the same, but unfortunately, they are being treated in the same way, as though any critique of Israel or any support offered to the Palestinian cause is seen in itself as a kind of hate speech, as a violation of, various principles of equity and fairness and so on. And so whether we're talking about scholars, students, politicians, activists, many people have had their livelihoods threatened. They've suffered consequences at their places of employment or places of study. They've been doxxed on social media. They've had their names paraded around to incite violence or trolling against them. And this is just completely unacceptable. Everybody should have the right to raise their own conscientious objections towards the actions of the state of Israel without automatically being accused of anti-Semitism. And I think we really have to continue to stand up for and shore up this right, and to call out these incidents when we see them, and to offer our support to the individuals that are being affected by this.
Now, there was a bizarre incident in St. John in December involving the Liberal MP Wayne Long. Video clips have circulated widely on social media showing Wayne Long and a member of his staff in a heated dispute with protesters. This was on a city street in uptown St. John, outside of a Liberal Party holiday gathering. And in the footage, as you know, Long and the staffer tell protesters, "Shame on you." These were protesters calling for a ceasefire from the Palestine Solidarity Committee of St. John. At one point, the staffer exclaims "terrorists" before telling protesters, "You guys believe in terrorism." And in a separate short clip, she appears to tell someone, "If you don't like Canada, leave."
Shame on all of you. Shame on all of you.
Do you really think that?
Yeah,
Do you
terrorists.
actually think that all those children that are dying over there is okay? Terrorists! Wow. Wow.
Wayne Long later issued a statement saying that he regretted his remarks, which he called hurtful and inappropriate. Your thoughts on this incident and the response to it? What does the state say about the state of affairs in New Brunswick?
Sure. Well, I appreciate that MP Long did issue an apology there, but certainly the fact that in any moment it seemed to him and his staffer like an appropriate thing to do to confront protesters who were calling for a ceasefire, right? To be advocating for peace, even a temporary peace, and then to be called terrorists, it just kind of really stretches the limits of credulity. But unfortunately, this is the broader cultural context that we're in. That again, anybody who is in solidarity with the Palestinian cause is often seen to be aligned with Hamas, although that is certainly not the case for many, many individuals, including many Palestinians themselves. But we completely lack any nuance in terms of our conversations about this. I think there's a lot of ignorance about these issues, and we see, in the case of the comments of, why don't you leave? Why don't you get out of Canada? I mean, these are just, the kind of broad, racist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic comments that unfortunately target many different immigrant groups. But in this case, we see it as a way of, again, trying to silence any critique of Israel, or even just the simple act of calling for a ceasefire, which honestly should be, a given, in the sense that, everybody claims they would like to see peace in the region, and yet we somehow it's controversial to ask people, to ask the state of Israel and Hamas to agree to a ceasefire. So yeah, I think it's a very unfortunate incident that reveals both an ignorance and a prejudice about this situation, and a broader anti-immigrant prejudice that really should have no place in the government of New Brunswick.
Canada is known internationally as one of the staunchest supporters of the state of Israel, and it seems that support for the Palestinian cause is something of a third rail in Canadian politics. Then, on the other hand, there have been frequent protests in New Brunswick calling for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip that seem to have been largely ignored in the mainstream media. Could you comment on what seems to be practically a media blackout?
Yes, I agree that there's been shockingly little coverage of this, or yeah, a kind of silence or marginalization of these things, or they're presented in a very negative light, again, as though these are radical rabble rousers that are, so far outside of any kind of political norm or spectrum that we almost don't even have to engage with what they're saying. I appreciate your analogy there of the third rail. People, both politically and in the media, I think are very afraid to touch this issue, in part because I think they rightly know that any hint of sympathy, of balanced coverage of Palestinian solidarity is likely to immediately trigger accusations of anti-Semitism. And I don't blame anybody for not wanting to be accused of anti-Semitism. However, I do think the media has a duty to always question its own biases. It's there to question the assumptions and taken for granted norms and the voices that come from those in power. It's there to speak back to power in many ways. And yet, unfortunately, we're seeing this silence, as you put it, this alignment and acceptance of the dominant narrative that's there. So I would certainly be very excited to see any organizations in the mainstream media willing to, if not take a stand, then to at least offer some semblance of balanced and fair coverage.
The group Independent Jewish Voices, this is a national organization. It has been around for some time. The New Brunswick chapter was actually formed quite recently, in recent months, since the beginning of the war. Could you talk briefly about how it was formed and why?
Yes, well, I think some of the founding members were themselves members of IJV at a national level and realized that there wasn't actually any representation of IJV in anywhere in New Brunswick as a kind of regional chapter, or even a Fredericton chapter or anything like that. And so they thought that, given the fact that there was a lot of attention because of the ongoing war at this moment, a need for people to feel that they were not so isolated, perhaps in their views, that they decided to form this New Brunswick chapter. And at the moment, we're a small but mighty group with representatives of people from many regions across the province who are meeting regularly virtually to both figure out how we can respond to incidents such as the Wayne Long incident or the vandalism at the Fredericton Shul, how we can support other activists in locations around New Brunswick, how we can continue to educate, which is a key mission of IJV in general, to bring some nuance and some greater knowledge around these issues, and to show our leaders here in New Brunswick and beyond that some of those mainstream Jewish organizations, they don't speak for all Jews. Just like any other group in society, Jews are not homogeneous. We do not all share the same beliefs about issues such as the state of Israel. But unfortunately, many of those non-mainstream Jewish voices are also drowned out. So the IJV New Brunswick chapter formation gives us a bit of a structure to try to showcase this variety of views and standpoints, and to try to bring together both Jewish people and supporters of the anti-Zionist cause to have a place to come together and work towards, first a ceasefire and a stop of the ongoing violence right now, and together for a longer term solution to this decades-old crisis.
And finally, as we record this interview on February 14th, there are reports of attacks by the Israeli Defense Forces on Rafah, where more than a million people have congregated as they've been displaced from other parts of the Gaza Strip. During this time, the Premier Blaine Higgs has made support for Israel plank in his re-election campaign, or I should say that at this time on his re-election campaign website, Israel and support for Israel is prominently featured. Just any comment on the Premier's positioning himself as a staunch supporter for Israel at this time?
Well, I mean, I think it's very much in line both with the larger conservative viewpoint across Canada, as well as pretty much all major political parties across Canada. It's not surprising to see, but certainly as a member of IJV New Brunswick, I would really urge Premier Higgs to listen again to this variety of voices, both from the Jewish community and the Palestinian community, of which there is one here in New Brunswick, and to especially at this very critical moment, as you mentioned, the situation in Rafah is very dire, and I think we're about to witness an even more heinous phase of what many of us are calling genocide. And to Premier Higgs, I would say, unfortunately, you're going to be on the wrong side of history on this one.
Anything else to add before we wrap up?
No, thank you so much for these thoughtful questions and for giving us an opportunity to share these points of view with you today.
Thank you for speaking to the NB Media Co-op today. Leslie Kern, member of Independent Jewish Voices New Brunswick, feminist urban scholar, and professor at Mount Allison University. Thank you very much.
Thank you.